The dust had not yet settled on the road behind her when Lydia Merriweather walked through the last iron gate of the Barlow ranch, her boots worn clean through at the heel, her baby daughter balanced on her hip like she had been carrying the weight of the whole world, in exactly that position for the better part of 6 months. The Texas sun was merciless that afternoon in the summer of 1878, hanging low and blazing over the flat land like a brand pressed against the sky, and Lydia had been walking since before dawn with nothing but a half-empty canteen, a cloth sack of dwindling provisions, and the stubborn, burning certainty that she had nowhere else on this earth left to go. She had heard about Silas Barlow in the town of Cutter's Creek, 30 miles back, from a widow woman named Mabel Finch, who ran the dry goods store with one eye on her customers and one eye on the door, like she was always expecting somebody to walk in and change everything. Mabel had pressed a strip of dried venison into Lydia's free hand, looked at the baby with kind eyes and a sad mouth, and said there was a cattle rancher about a day's hard walk south by southwest who was known to be a decent man, the kind who did not turn folks away from his gate. Lydia had not asked whether he took in stray women with fatherless babies. She had just thanked Mabel for the venison and walked south by southwest until her feet ached so fiercely she could feel every grain of Texas dirt through the cracked leather of her soles. Now she stood at the edge of the wide dirt yard before a solid, well-built ranch house with a covered porch running the whole length of the front, a barn that smelled of horses and hay and something warm and living, and a windmill spinning slow and patient in the distance above a water trough. There were men working somewhere out beyond the fence line. She could hear voices and the occasional clang of metal, and a dog, a big amber-colored thing with floppy ears, raised its head from the porch steps and regarded her without alarm. The baby Clara was 8 months old and had been mercifully quiet for the last hour, lulled into drowsiness by the rhythm of Lydia's walking, but now she stirred against her mother's shoulder and made a small sound of displeasure, squirming as though she sensed the stillness around them and found it suspicious. "I know," Lydia murmured to her. "I know, sweetheart. Just a moment longer." She did not know what she would say when someone came to the door. She had been rehearsing it in her head for miles, trying out different versions, different tones, but they all sounded desperate because they were desperate, and she had never been a woman who was good at hiding the truth of things. Her mother had always said that Lydia's face was a window with the curtains pulled open and nothing hidden behind the glass, and she supposed that had served her poorly in certain situations and tolerably well in others. She was 24 years old. She was a widow. She had 37 cents to her name and a baby daughter, and the particular kind of courage that comes not from fearlessness, but from having absolutely no alternative left. She was still standing there, summoning herself, when the front door of the ranch house opened. The man who stepped out onto the porch was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck where it had grown out past the point of tidiness. He wore a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, dark trousers, and boots that had seen considerable use. His face was weathered and angular, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something that did not give easily, and dark eyes that caught the afternoon light and held it with a kind of quiet steadiness. He stopped when he saw her. His hand rested on the porch railing, and for a moment neither of them spoke. He looked at her, then at the baby on her hip, then back at her face, and she watched him take in the state of her, the exhaustion and the dust and the thinness around her cheeks and the absolute determination she was wearing like armor. She opened her mouth to begin whatever speech she had been piecing together. He said, "Come inside, both of you," just like that. No questions, no hesitation, no examination of her circumstances or her character or her right to be standing in his yard. Just those 4 words, steady and certain, like it was the most natural thing in the world to open a door to a woman he had never seen before and the baby on her hip. Lydia felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized she'd been holding tight for a very long time. She walked up the porch steps. His name, she learned in the next hour, was Silas Barlow, and he was 31 years old, and he had owned the Barlow Ranch for 6 years, having bought it from an older rancher named Amos Creed, who had decided to retire east of the Mississippi with enough money to keep himself comfortable. The ranch ran about 1,200 acres and carried a decent herd of longhorn cattle, and Silas employed 4 permanent hands and took on extra help during the season. He told her all of this matter-of-factly while he moved around the kitchen, which was a real kitchen with a proper cast iron stove, and a long wooden table and shelves of provisions that made Lydia's eyes go a little wide with relief. He heated water for coffee without being asked, and he set out bread and cold sliced beef and a jar of peach preserves, and he did not once make her feel that she was being studied or judged while he did it. He just moved quietly around the kitchen, and Lydia sat at the table with Clara in her lap and tried to remember the last time anyone had made her feel this quietly welcome anywhere. "I should explain myself," she said, when he placed a mug of coffee in front of her. He sat down across from her and wrapped both hands around his own mug. "You do not have to." "I want to," she said, because she did. She needed him to understand, not because she owed him an explanation for existing, but because she had been carrying the story alone for so long it had started to feel like something she could not breathe around properly. He looked at her across the table and nodded once, and she told him. She had married Thomas Merriweather in the spring of 1876 in a small town called Harding, in the Texas Panhandle. Thomas had been handsome and charming and full of plans the way some men are, the kind of man who could paint a picture of the future so vivid and bright that you could almost see it shining there in the air between his hands. He had talked about land and cattle and building something, and Lydia had believed him, because she had wanted very much to believe in something at the age of 22, and Thomas had seemed like a man worth believing in. The plans had not worked out the way he described them. He had been bad with money in ways she had not understood until it was too late, spending recklessly and borrowing foolishly, and making promises to men whose patience was not infinite. He had not been unkind to her. She wanted to make sure Silas understood that. He had not been cruel, just weak in the way that certain men are weak when the world does not bend to meet their expectations of it. He had died in the winter of 1877, of pneumonia, leaving her with a 2-month-old baby, a stack of debts, and a 1-room rented house in Harding that the landlord reclaimed within a fortnight of the funeral. She had gone to her mother-in-law first, which had been a mistake she should have anticipated but hadn't. Eliza Merriweather was a cold woman who had never fully approved of her son's choice of wife, and she had made it plain within the first week that she considered Lydia's presence in her house a charity she was not inclined to extend indefinitely. She had tolerated Clara in the thin and joyless way of someone performing a duty, but she had made it equally plain that she did not consider the child's welfare her permanent responsibility. After 3 months of that, Lydia had taken what little she had, gathered Clara and her cloth sack, and started moving. She had worked where she could, cooking and washing and mending in exchange for meals and sometimes shelter, and she had slowly, imperfectly, been making her way toward something she could not yet name, just away from everywhere she had been. When she stopped talking, the kitchen was very quiet except for the sound of Clara happily gumming a corner of bread that Silas had torn from the loaf and offered to the baby without ceremony, and the baby had accepted it with the grave concentration of someone undertaking important work. Silas was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee. "My father walked out when I was 11, he said, not looking up immediately. "Left my mother with this land and 3 boys and not much else. She kept it running for 4 years by herself before she remarried. I know something about carrying more than your share." He looked up then, and there was something in his dark eyes that was not pity, nothing like pity, but something quieter and more respectful than that. "You can stay here," he said. "We've got a spare room at the end of the hall." Hattie, my cook and housekeeper, she's getting on in years and she's been asking me about someone to help her with the house. If you're willing to work, there's a place for you here." Lydia looked at him for a long moment. She was not a fool, and she was not naive, and she knew that the world being what it was, kindness from a man had its own complications and sometimes its own price. But there was something in the way Silas Barlow sat across from her, something in the uncomplicated directness of his offer and the way he had looked at her daughter without a shadow of resentment, that made her trust him in a way she could not entirely explain. "Why?" she asked, not belligerently, just honestly. He considered that. "Because you need it," he said, "and because there is nothing in this world that says a woman in your situation ought to be turned away from a decent roof." She stayed. Hattie Carlson was 63 years old, round as a barrel, with iron-gray hair she kept in a braid as thick as a man's wrist, and a manner of speaking that was entirely without unnecessary softness but managed to be warm anyway. The way a good wool blanket is warm, functional and honest, and better than you expected. She had been cooking and keeping house for Silas for 4 years, ever since his previous arrangement had fallen apart, and she received Lydia with the brisk efficiency of someone who had already decided an opinion and was simply confirming it with observation. She looked Lydia up and down, looked at Clara, said, "Can you bake bread?" And when Lydia said yes, Hattie said, "Good, because mine's been going stiff on the second day and I can't figure out why." And that was essentially the entirety of Lydia's welcome from Hattie Carlson, which suited Lydia just fine, because it meant she was being treated like a person rather than a project. The spare room was at the end of the hallway, past the main bedroom and a small sitting room, and it was modest but clean, with a brass-framed bed and a narrow window that looked out toward the eastern fence line and the land beyond it. Silas had put a wooden drawer on the floor lined with blankets for Clara to sleep in, which Clara regarded with suspicion for the first 2 nights, and then accepted as her domain. Lydia slept better that first night than she had in 4 months. The days on the Barlow ranch had a rhythm to them that Lydia fell into with a gratitude that was almost physical, like finding solid ground under her feet after a long time walking on unstable things. She was up before dawn with Hattie, starting the stove and getting the coffee going and making breakfast for Silas and the 4 hands, men named Orrin, Pete, Caleb, and a young man of about 19 called Rope, which was apparently a nickname whose origin no one seemed entirely sure about anymore. They ate at the long kitchen table, all of them together, and Lydia learned quickly that the best approach was to be busy and capable and direct, because ranch hands were not complicated in their social assessments. They decided about you fast and held that decision firmly. And what they decided about Lydia within the first week was that she could hold her own and was not to be trifled with, which was exactly what she wanted them to decide. Clara was a source of considerable entertainment and some confusion among the hands, who were all men in their 20s and 30s and largely unused to babies. Orrin, who was 42 and had 3 grown children of his own, was the one who most naturally knew what to do with an infant, and he occasionally held Clara with the comfortable ease of long practice, bouncing her gently against his knee, while the others watched with expressions ranging from bafflement to cautious delight. Silas himself watched Clara with a careful sort of attention that Lydia noticed, but did not quite know what to make of at first. He was not the kind of man who cooed and made ridiculous faces, but sometimes she would come into a room and find him crouched down to Clara's level, talking to her in a low, unhurried voice about something entirely mundane, the state of the fence on the north pasture, or the particular temperament of a horse named Biscuit. And Clara would stare at him with those wide, serious brown eyes and occasionally reach out and grab his finger and hold it, and Silas would sit very still and let her. Lydia would stand in the doorway and watch this and feel something shift in the architecture of her chest. She was careful with it. She was careful with all of it, because she was a practical woman who had learned practical lessons, and she knew that gratitude could masquerade as deeper feeling, and that proximity and kindness could build something that looked like love but was really just need wearing love's clothing. She did not want to make that mistake again. She did not want to mistake Thomas Merriweather again, though Silas was nothing like Thomas in any way she could identify. But she was careful. The trouble arrived in the middle of August, about 6 weeks after Lydia came to the ranch, and it came in the form of a man named Roy Dunster. Roy Dunster was Thomas Merriweather's cousin, and he was the specific kind of ugly that had nothing to do with his face, which was actually reasonably put together, and everything to do with the quality of his character, which was the sort that assumed the world owed him things and became unpleasant when it did not deliver. He arrived at the gate of the Barlow ranch on a mid-morning when Silas was out on the far pasture with Orrin and Caleb, and Lydia was hanging laundry on the line while Hattie watched Clara on the porch. He rode up to the yard on a roan horse and did not dismount at first, just sat there looking at Lydia with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Ya Merriweather," he said, "I have been looking for you a fair while." She straightened up from the laundry basket and looked at him steadily. "Roy," she said. "Nice place you found yourself," he said, looking around the yard with an appreciation that managed to be insulting. "Whose hospitality are you enjoying this time?" "That is none of your concern," she said. He dismounted then, and she noticed he had the particular loose-limbed ease of a man who had never had cause to be afraid of anything he was walking toward. He was her height and broader, and he had a revolver on his hip that she doubted was merely decorative. "My Aunt Eliza is worried about the baby," he said, and the false warmth in his voice was so poorly constructed she almost marveled at the effort. "She thinks you have no business raising Thomas's child on your own. She asked me to bring the girl home to her." "Clara is my daughter," Lydia said, and there was nothing in her voice that wavered. "She is not going anywhere with you." "Now, Lydia, you can get back on your horse," she said, "and go back to Eliza Merriweather and tell her that Clara is healthy and cared for, and that if she wants to correspond with me by letter she is welcome to, but I will not send my daughter anywhere, and I will not receive visits I have not invited." Roy Dunster's face changed slightly, the false warmth smoothing into something flatter and less pleasant. He might have said something further, or done something she would have had to respond to, but at that moment the sound of hooves came from beyond the barn, and Silas rode into the yard on a dark bay horse, with Orrin a length behind him. Silas had apparently ridden in early for some errand Lydia did not know about, and he pulled up at the edge of the yard and looked from Lydia to Roy Dunster with a measuring attention that took in the whole picture very quickly. He dismounted without hurry and came to stand beside Lydia, not in front of her, beside her, which she noticed. "Help you with something?" he asked Roy. Roy looked at Silas with the recalibrating expression of someone who had expected to be dealing with a woman alone and was adjusting his approach. "Just visiting Mrs. Merriweather," he said pleasantly. "She does not look like she is finding it a pleasant visit," Silas said. There was a pause in which Roy considered his options. "The Merriweather family has an interest in the welfare of the child," Roy said, with an attempt at dignity. "The child's welfare is being looked after," Silas said. He looked at Roy with a steadiness that was not aggressive but was absolutely immovable. "Mrs. Merriweather is here under my roof and my protection. If the Merriweather family has concerns, they can write a letter. If you have business on this property, state it. If you don't, then I'll ask you to ride on." Roy looked at him for a long moment, then looked at Lydia, then looked back at Silas. He rode on. When he was through the gate and down the road, Lydia let out a slow breath. She looked at Silas, who had watched Roy until he was a proper distance away before turning back to her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He nodded as though that was sufficient and no further ceremony was required on the matter. "If he comes back," he said, "you tell me directly." She looked at him for a moment, this man who had called her his protection without making it sound like a claim, and she felt the careful architecture inside her chest shift again in a way that was beginning to alarm her slightly. "I will," she said. Roy Dunster did not come back, at least not immediately, and the days of late August moved with the dry heat of a Texas summer that seemed to have no end in it, a heat that shimmered off the land and made the distant hills look like they were breathing. Lydia worked hard, and she was good at it, and she found a satisfaction in the work that was clean and uncomplicated, the satisfaction of bread that rose properly and laundry that dried white in the sun, and a kitchen that ran on schedule, and a baby who was growing pink-cheeked and strong in the good air. She and Hattie developed a routine that was less an arrangement and more a conversation between two competent women who had figured out how to speak each other's language. Hattie told her about the ranch's history, about Amos Creed, and the hard early years when Silas had been buying the place and the mortgage had been a thing of considerable anxiety, and about the drought of 1874 that had taken half the cattle and a great deal of Silas's patience. "He never quit, though," Hattie said one afternoon, her hands busy with a pie crust. "A lot of men would have sold and moved on. Silas is not that kind of man. He puts his shoulder to it and he pushes, and he does not let go of what matters to him." Lydia was peeling apples across the table, and she felt Hattie's eyes on her as she said this, though Hattie appeared to be entirely focused on her pastry. "He seems like a steady man," Lydia said, which was true and also the safest thing to say. "Steady," Hattie repeated as though she was turning the word over. "That is a word for it. He has been steady a long time. Steady and alone, which is a particular kind of tired that gets into a person's bones." Lydia did not say anything to that, and Hattie did not push it further, and they finished the pie in a companionable silence. On an evening in the first week of September, when the heat had begun to ease just slightly, and the sky in the west was doing something extraordinary with shades of orange and rose, Silas came to find her where she was sitting on the porch after supper, Clara asleep in the crook of her arm. He leaned against the porch railing and looked at the sky, and for a while neither of them spoke, which had become a comfortable thing between them, the silence. She had learned that Silas Barlow was a man who did not fill silence just to fill it, and she had found this to be one of the most restful qualities a person could possess. "Clara's getting big," he said. "She is," Lydia said. "She tried to pull herself up on the table leg this morning." He looked at the sleeping baby with that quiet, considering attention. "She's going to be walking before you know it." "Lord help me," Lydia said. He smiled, and it changed his face in a way that always struck her slightly unprepared, because Silas Barlow's smile was not something he gave out carelessly, and when it came it had a warmth to it that seemed at odds with the angular seriousness of his usual expression, like sunlight breaking through a cloudy day when you had stopped expecting it. They were quiet again for a while. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the north fence. I want to extend the line another quarter-mile east. There's good grazing land there that we are not using." She looked at him. "You are telling me about your fence plans. You run this house," he said without any weight on it, just as a fact. "I think you ought to know what is happening on the rest of the property." She sat with this for a moment, the quiet generosity of being included. "That sounds like a good plan," she said. "The cattle have been crowding the south pasture." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "Orrin mentioned it," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Orrin doesn't mention things to people he doesn't respect." She looked up at him. The sky was doing its best work now, the colors deepening toward purple at the edges, and his face in the fading light had a quality she found it increasingly difficult to look at too long without feeling the careful architecture of her caution developing cracks. She looked back at the sleeping baby. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it for more than one specific thing, and from the way the silence settled after she said it, she thought he understood that. October came, and with it a letter. Lydia recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she even fully read the name in the corner, because Lydia Merriweather's penmanship had a particular cramped quality, as though every letter was being pressed out under protest. She read it in the kitchen while Hattie was occupied in the garden, and Clara sat on the floor batting at a wooden spoon with great industry. The letter was, in Eliza's way, both formally worded and deeply unkind. It informed Lydia that the Merriweather family, meaning Eliza herself and certain allied relatives, had consulted with a lawyer in Harding about the matter of Clara's guardianship. It suggested that a widow woman of no fixed address and no established income working in another man's household was not an appropriate guardian for a Merriweather child. It invited Lydia to reconsider the arrangements for the child's upbringing before things required a more formal resolution. It was, essentially, a threat dressed up in legal language and the thin veneer of familial concern. Lydia read it twice, folded it carefully, and sat for a moment. Clara looked up at her from the floor, apparently sensing something in the atmosphere, and offered her the wooden spoon in the manner of a gift. "Thank you, sweetheart," Lydia said. She went to find Silas. He was in the barn, working on a saddle that needed restitching, and he looked up when she came in. She handed him the letter without preamble. He read it, and she watched his jaw set, which was a very particular expression on Silas Barlow's face that she had come to identify as the physical equivalent of something very strong being held very still. He folded the letter and gave it back to her. "You have an income," he said. "I will write you a formal agreement for your wages. Hattie can witness it. That addresses one of their claims. It says no fixed address." "You have an address," he said. "This ranch." She looked at him. "That is a legal argument that might not hold without a more formal arrangement." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the saddle. "What sort of arrangement did you have in mind?" The air in the barn was warm and smelled of horse and hay and leather, and the light coming through the high window made a bar of gold across the swept dirt floor. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't want to put you in an awkward position." He looked at her then directly in that straightforward way he had that seemed to require nothing in return except equal honesty. "I am not awkwardly positioned," he said. "I want to help you keep your daughter. Tell me what you need." She thought about it for a long moment. "If I could argue that I have a stable household, a permanent position, a fixed and respectable address," she said carefully, "I think that might be enough to discourage Eliza from pursuing this." "Then we make that argument," he said. "I would need Hattie to be willing to attest to my position here." "Hattie will say what's true," he said, "that you work hard and you keep this house and your daughter is well cared for." She nodded, relieved. "And if there were a lawyer in Cutter's Creek willing to help me draft a reply—" "I know a man named Fletcher," Silas said. "He practices in Cutter's Creek. He is not a fancy lawyer, but he is a thorough one, and he does not like bullying." She felt the tightness in her chest ease, and in its place came something that was not just relief but something warmer, something that she tried very hard to keep at arm's length and was finding increasingly difficult to maintain at the proper distance. "Silas," she said, and her voice came out softer than she intended, "I don't know how to repay all of this." He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes and said, with perfect simplicity, "I am not keeping an account." Fletcher the lawyer was a small, precise man with round spectacles and the ink-stained fingers of someone who spent considerable time writing, and he received them in his office in Cutter's Creek with the brisk efficiency of someone who did not waste his client's time. He read Eliza Merriweather's letter carefully, asked Lydia a number of pointed questions about her circumstances, and then wrote several sentences on a piece of paper and showed her. "This is the substance of the reply," he said. "Mrs. Merriweather is employed as housekeeper at the Barlow Ranch in Tanner County. She maintains a permanent domicile at said ranch, receives regular wages of which I can provide attestation, and her daughter Clara is in excellent health and care, as any inspection would confirm. The Merriweather family's concerns, while perhaps well-intentioned, do not represent legal grounds for any claim of guardianship, and any attempt to pursue such a claim would be vigorously contested." He looked at her over his spectacles. "Is all of that accurate?" "The wages need to be formalized," she said, glancing at Silas. "We are prepared to formalize them today," Silas told Fletcher. "I have brought a written agreement to that effect." Fletcher looked between them for a moment with the neutral assessment of a man who had seen many situations and catalogued them efficiently. "Very well," he said, and proceeded to make it formal. Riding back to the ranch in Silas's wagon that afternoon, with Clara sitting between them and regarding the passing landscape with great interest. Lydia felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a very long time. "Do you think she will pursue it further?" she asked. "She might try," he said. "But Fletcher's letter will make it plain that she is looking at a real legal contest, and from what you've told me about Eliza Merriweather, she strikes me as someone who wants results without effort. A real contest will likely discourage her." "You may be right," Lydia said. Clara chose this moment to grab Silas's sleeve with both fists and use it as leverage to pull herself up to standing on the wagon bench, which she then regarded as a considerable triumph and expressed with a loud crow of satisfaction. Silas looked at the baby, who was standing on the bench between them, triumphant and wobbly, holding his sleeve for balance, and he put one large, careful hand flat behind her back to steady her without interrupting her moment of victory. Lydia watched this and felt a warmth in her chest so specific and particular that she could no longer pretend she did not know its name. She looked at the road ahead and held it in, carefully, the way you hold something that might be too big for the space it is trying to fill. The letter to Eliza Merriweather was sent. The weeks passed without any reply, which was in itself a kind of answer, or at least a deferral, and Lydia began to breathe more fully in the matter of her daughter's safety. She did not assume the threat was entirely gone, but the immediacy of it had receded, and in its place was the ordinary texture of daily life on the ranch, which was full and useful and increasingly, insidiously, felt like home. She noticed things about Silas that she had no business noticing, or rather, she noticed that she noticed them, which was its own kind of evidence. She noticed that he drank his coffee black and in 2 cups and never a third. She noticed that he was always the last person to sit down at a meal, always making sure everyone else was served first. She noticed that he was almost incapable of walking past an animal in distress without doing something about it, that he had brought 2 injured birds and a half-dead cat through the barn in the month she had been there, and each time he had deposited the creature in Hattie's general direction, with the expression of a man who was not prepared to discuss it. She noticed that he watched her sometimes when he thought she was not looking, with an expression she was afraid to interpret too directly, because interpreting it directly would require her to admit things she had been carefully not admitting. October became November, and the Texas autumn brought cooler nights and a wind that came down from the north with a new sharpness to it. The ranch had a quiet season coming, the big work of the cattle drive having been done earlier, and the rhythm of the days shifted into something slower and more interior. One evening, when Hattie had gone to bed early with a headache and Clara was deeply asleep, and the hands were in the bunkhouse, Lydia and Silas were alone in the kitchen. She was mending a shirt, one of his. She had offered without thinking and then felt strange about it afterward, and he was at the table with the ranch accounts, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, which she had not known he needed, and which made him look unexpectedly approachable in a way that did something complicated to her composure. She was not sure which of them spoke first, or about what. It started with something ordinary, something about whether the supply order needed to be adjusted before winter, and then it moved the way conversations sometimes do, when the people having them have been careful for a long time and the evening is quiet and the lamp is low and there is no particular reason to stay on the safe and documented paths. He said, "Do you miss Harding?" She thought about it honestly. "I miss who I thought I was going to be there," she said. "I don't miss being there." He took off his reading glasses and set them on the table. "Who did you think you were going to be?" "Someone settled," she said. "Someone who had a home that stayed put." "You have a home that stays put now," he said. "Or you can have one for as long as you want it." She looked at him. The lamplight was doing things to the planes of his face, and the mending was still in her hands, and she felt acutely aware of every inch of the distance between them across the kitchen table. "Silas," she said, and then stopped because she did not know exactly what came next, what she had the right to ask or say. He waited in that patient way he had, that particular quality of stillness that was not absence but presence, waiting without pressure. "I don't want you to think I am here because I need to be," she said. "I mean, I needed to be at the beginning." But she stopped and looked at the mending in her hands, then back up at him. "I want to be here now, that is a different thing." The kitchen was very quiet. "I know the difference," he said. "Do you?" she said. "Because I want to make sure you know that it is a difference. I'm not confusing gratitude with—" She stopped again. "With what?" he asked, and his voice was level, but there was something in it, something careful and watching. She set down the mending. "I think you know with what," she said, which was perhaps the most direct thing she had ever said to him, and her heart was doing something undignified in her chest. Silas was quiet for a long moment, looking at her with those dark eyes. Then he said, "I think you know that I am not asking you to feel anything in particular. I told you that when you came." "I know," she said, "but what I feel is not something I asked about, and it has developed opinions of its own." Something in his expression shifted very slightly, a warming, a careful unlocking. "Lydia," he said. He said her name and then stopped, as though the name itself was something that required its own moment, which was, she thought, a rather overwhelming thing to do to a person. "Yes," she said, which was possibly not a complete response but felt like the right one. He got up from his chair and came around the table, which was 3 steps and also felt like a very significant distance being closed, and he stood in front of her and looked at her with an expression that was not uncertain but was also not rushing, everything happening at the pace of something real and careful and considered. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, very gently, and his hand stayed at her jaw for a moment. "I have been trying," he said, "to be sensible about this." "Sensible," she said. "Yes, so have I. I am not sure I am going to keep managing it," he said. "I am not sure I want you to," she said. He kissed her then, quietly and thoroughly, in the lamplight of the kitchen, and it was nothing like the urgent desperation she might have feared or the false glamour of something that was not real. It was just honest and warm and entirely itself. And when it ended, she was still sitting in her chair and his forehead was resting against hers, and they were both breathing as though they had been somewhere considerable. "Well," Hattie said from the doorway. They both looked up. Hattie was standing there in her wrapper with her braid over one shoulder and the expression of someone who had come for a glass of water and received a great deal more than she expected. "My headache is quite better," she said, with magnificent dignity, and went back to bed. Lydia laughed genuinely, fully, the kind of laugh that comes up from somewhere deep, and Silas's face broke into a smile so warm and real that she felt it like sunlight. And she thought that she had been very wrong earlier in the autumn to be so careful, or perhaps she had been exactly right, because now that she was here, now that she knew what this was, she knew she had not made a mistake. She had come to this place lost and exhausted, with 37 cents and a baby on her hip, and something had been waiting for her here that she had not known to hope for. December arrived with cold winds and the smell of snow coming down from the north, and a notice from Fletcher, the lawyer, that Eliza Merriweather had retained a lawyer in Harding named Gideon Sparks. Fletcher forwarded the relevant documents with a note in his precise handwriting that said simply, "We should meet. This is more serious than she was prepared to attempt." The 3 of them, Lydia, Silas, and Fletcher, met in the Cutter's Creek office on a Tuesday. The documents from Sparks were more formal and more specific than the original letter. They argued, in the language of the law, that Lydia Merriweather was residing in an unmarried state in the household of an unrelated man, and that this arrangement was morally unsuitable for the raising of a child of good family, and that the Merriweather family should be granted legal guardianship of Clara Merriweather, the infant daughter of the late Thomas Merriweather. Lydia sat in Fletcher's office and read this, and felt a coldness in her stomach that was pure fear. "The morality argument," Fletcher said, "is the one that concerns me. The law in Texas at this point in time gives some weight to questions of moral character in custody matters. A widow residing in an unmarried household with a male property owner is, in the court's view." He paused. "It is not ideal." Silas, who was sitting beside Lydia, said, Then we change the arrangement. She looked at him. He looked at her, and there was nothing ambiguous or uncertain in his expression, just that same steady, clear attention. "If you are willing," he said, and his voice was very quiet and very certain. "I am not asking because of the legal problem. I want you to understand that. I am asking because I have been intending to ask, and this has moved the timeline." "Silas," she began. "I know this is fast," he said, "and I know you have reasons to be careful. But I am asking you clearly, Lydia, because I want you to know exactly what I mean. Will you marry me?" Fletcher appeared to be studying his desk with great concentration. Lydia looked at Silas Barlow, this man who had opened his door without hesitation, who had stood beside her without making it a claim, who had held her daughter's hand and kissed her in the lamplight, and was now, with the most straightforward and unfussy declaration she had ever received, asking her to stay in the place she had already decided was home. "Yes," she said, "not because of the legal problem." "No," he agreed. "Because I want to," she said. "Good," he said. "That is the only reason that matters." Fletcher looked up from his desk. "Shall I also draft the response to Gideon Sparks?" he asked, with the professional calm of a man who handled remarkable mornings regularly. "Yes," said Silas, "and put it plainly." They were married on the 15th of December, 1878, in the parlor of the ranch house, by a circuit preacher named Reverend Oakes, who came through Tanner County every 6 weeks, and had the warm, unhurried manner of someone who had seen a great many things and found most of them worth celebrating. Hattie stood up with Lydia, and Orrin stood up with Silas, and Clara sat in Pete's arms and wore the expression of someone who was not entirely certain what was happening, but was broadly in favor of the general festivity. Lydia wore a dress that Hattie had produced from a trunk, dark blue wool that had belonged to a sister who had been roughly Lydia's size, and it fit well enough that it might have been made for her. She had done her hair up in a way she had not bothered with in months, and when she came into the parlor and saw Silas standing there in his good jacket with his dark hair combed, and his face bearing the expression of a man who was watching something arrive that he had not expected to have, she understood that she had been building toward this moment for a long time without quite knowing it. The Reverend's words were simple, and they meant what they said, and when Silas put the ring on her finger, a plain gold band that had been his mother's, she felt the whole weight of the past year lift and settle into something different, something with shape and structure and ground under it. He kissed her when the Reverend told him he could, and Hattie wept without any apparent embarrassment, and Orrin shook Silas's hand and then thought better of it and embraced him, and even Rope, who had stood in the doorway throughout because there was not enough room, let out a whoop that made Clara jump and then laugh. The response to Eliza Merriweather's legal challenge, drafted by Fletcher and mailed 2 days after the wedding, was brief and definitive. Mrs. Lydia Barlow, formerly Merriweather, was the legally wedded wife of Silas Barlow of the Barlow Ranch in Tanner County, Texas. She maintained a permanent household and was the primary caregiver to her daughter Clara Merriweather, who was in excellent health and wanted for nothing. The family's concerns regarding her living arrangements were now entirely moot, and any further legal challenge would be met accordingly. The response from Gideon Sparks came 6 weeks later and was brief in a different kind of way, simply noting that his client had chosen not to pursue the matter further at this time. There was nothing further after that. Eliza Merriweather, in her cramped and grudging way, had retreated. Lydia read the letter at the kitchen table and felt a quiet triumph that was clean and complete. Winter settled over the ranch with the particular fullness of a Texas winter, cold but not killing cold, with occasional snow that made the flat land white and strange and beautiful. Clara learned to pull herself up on the table leg she had been practicing on, and then to take experimental steps between things, and then one morning in January to simply let go and walk, 3 wobbling steps across the kitchen floor, before sitting down abruptly with great surprise at her own achievement. Lydia was there for it, and Silas was there for it, having come in for a mid-morning cup of coffee and caught the exact moment, and they looked at each other across the kitchen with the shared astonishment of the thing. And Lydia felt in that look something that was the particular happiness of a life being made properly, something built out of real materials, out of daily things and honest feeling, and the kind of love that does not perform itself but simply is. Silas was a good husband in the most literal and thorough sense of that word, not in the sense of grand gestures or elaborate declarations, but in the sense of being present and steady and fair, of treating her as his equal in the management of the ranch and the running of the house, of listening when she spoke and meaning what he said, and of looking at her across the dinner table sometimes with an expression that made her feel seen in the deepest and most specific way that one person can see another. He was also, she discovered over the winter months, unexpectedly funny. It was a dry, quiet humor that surfaced at odd moments, and it always caught her off guard, which she thought was part of the point, that he would say something in that same level, unhurried voice, and it would take her a beat to recognize it as a joke, and by the time she laughed, he would already be moving on to something else with a perfectly straight face. She loved this about him with a particularity that surprised her. The spring of 1879 came in warm and green, and with it came a great deal of work on the ranch. The new calves and the north fence extension, and a secondary water tank Silas had been planning for a year and a half. Lydia was part of all of it, not in the physical labor of cattle work, but in the planning and the accounts and the ordering of supplies, and Silas involved her in decisions with a naturalness that felt both respectful and simply correct. She also had news in the spring that she told him on an April evening when the light was long and golden, and they were on the porch after supper, and Clara was toddling around the yard under the careful supervision of the amber dog, whose name was Turner and who had appointed himself the baby's guardian with considerable seriousness. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked at her. "We are going to have a baby," she said. The evening was very still for a moment. Silas looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, something wide open and unguarded, something that was not composed or steady but just pure feeling, and then he reached out and took her face in both hands and kissed her with a tenderness so thorough she felt it move through her like warm water. "Are you well?" he asked when he pulled back and his voice was not quite steady. "Very well," she said. "Very happy." He held her then, standing on the porch in the April light, with the dog and the baby in the yard below them, and the land stretching out wide and full in every direction. And she could feel his heart beating under her ear, and she thought that this was exactly what she had been looking for when she had not known what she was looking for. Clara made her way to the bottom of the porch steps and reached up with both arms for her mother, and Lydia bent down and picked her up, and Silas's arm came around them both, and Turner settled himself with a great, contented sigh at the top of the porch steps, and the evening moved toward dusk with the unhurried certainty of a life that had found its footing. The summer of 1879 brought a new challenge to the ranch, one that had nothing to do with Lydia Merriweather or legal claims or the past, but with the practicalities of the present. The county was in the process of being surveyed and formally mapped, which was a federally mandated process that was broadly useful but specifically contentious, because the survey lines did not always agree with the informal and handshake-based boundary understandings that many ranchers had been operating on for years. A rancher to the north named Walt Greer had a disagreement with Silas about a strip of land along the north pasture fence that the survey was now putting formally on the Barlow side of the line. Greer was not a bad man, just a stubborn one, and he came to make his case 3 times over the course of June and July, each time with increasing frustration, and each time Silas heard him out with patience, and then said that he would not sign away land that was legally his. Lydia sat in on the 3rd meeting, having decided that her presence might help, and she took careful notes and afterward suggested that they offer Greer a grazing agreement on the disputed strip rather than a deed concession. It was a compromise that gave Greer what he actually needed, access to the good grass along that fence line, without requiring Silas to give up any formal ownership. Silas looked at her suggestion on the paper she had written it out on and then looked at her. "That is exactly right," he said. Greer accepted the agreement, and the dispute ended, and he and Silas shook hands on it, and afterward Greer tipped his hat to Lydia in a way that acknowledged something about who she was to the running of this place, and she received it as the compliment it was. Hattie, who watched all of this from the kitchen doorway, said to Lydia later, "Silas was always going to push until someone got their back up. You solved that in 10 minutes on a piece of paper." "He would have gotten there," Lydia said. "Eventually," Hattie agreed, with the precision of a woman who did not exaggerate in either direction. By the time August came and went and September arrived with its cooler mornings, Lydia was visibly, roundly pregnant and entirely comfortable with being so, which was a different experience from carrying Clara, when she had been alone and frightened, and Thomas had been alive but somehow already absent in the ways that mattered. This time she was home, and she was certain, and the baby growing in her was surrounded by something warm and real. Silas had built a proper cradle in the evenings, working in the barn with the kind of focused patience he brought to everything, and it stood in the corner of their bedroom, and Clara had inspected it with great suspicion, and then moved on to other concerns. On the 3rd of November, 1879, Lydia gave birth to a son. He was large and healthy and spectacularly loud, and he arrived in the small hours of the morning with Hattie in attendance and the ranch doctor, a man named Dr. Elam, who had ridden out from Cutter's Creek, and when he was cleaned and wrapped and placed in his father's arms, Silas stood very still and looked at the baby with an expression that Lydia, exhausted and triumphant, watched from the bed, and thought she would carry with her for the rest of her life. "Thomas?" Silas asked, his voice very quiet, and she understood he was asking whether she wanted to name the boy after her first husband, which was the kind of considerate and slightly painful question that only a man who loved her properly would think to ask. "No," she said, "not Thomas." She had loved Thomas in her way, and he had been Clara's father, and those things were true, but this baby was something entirely new, something born from a different life. "What about your father's name?" Silas looked at her. "Henry," he said. "Henry Barlow," she said. "That is a good name." Henry Barlow accepted the name with the equanimity of the very recently arrived, which is to say he slept through the discussion, and then woke up and was loudly enthusiastic about eating. And Silas sat on the edge of the bed and held Lydia's hand and looked at his son and his wife in the lamplight of the early morning, with an expression of a man who understood very clearly that he was in possession of everything that mattered. Clara, when she was introduced to her brother the following morning, crouched down beside the cradle and peered at him for a long time with the serious assessment of a small person confronting new information. "Baby," she announced, which was accurate. "Yes," Lydia said. "That is Henry. He is your brother." Clara considered this, then patted Henry's head with a careful, slightly proprietary hand. "Henry slept through this too." "Mine," Clara decided. "In a manner of speaking," Silas said from the doorway. The winter of 1879 and 1880 was the fullest winter Lydia had known since childhood, full of the good kind of fullness of a house that had people in it at all hours and children and work and warmth. Hattie spoiled Henry without apology and taught Clara how to stir batter, with the seriousness of a master instructing an apprentice. The four hands came in for meals and made ridiculous faces at both children, and Rope, who was now 21, had developed a particular bond with Clara that involved an enormous amount of hide-and-seek, and resulted in his being referred to as Rope by Clara in a tone of pure delight. Silas was a father in the same way he was everything, steadily and without display, but entirely committed, getting up in the night with Henry when he was fretful without Lydia having to ask, carrying Clara on his shoulders through the yard in the mornings to check on the horses with a seriousness that matched his own work inspections, but also included commentary on the morning sky and the behavior of specific chickens. Clara adored him with the whole and uncomplicated adoration of a small child who has decided that a particular person is theirs, and Silas received this adoration with a gruffness that fooled no one. In February of 1880, a letter arrived from Lydia Merriweather that was unlike any she had sent before. Lydia opened it with the old wariness, the habitual bracing, but the letter was short and it was different. Eliza wrote, in her cramped hand, that she had been unwell over the winter, and that she wished to see Clara, not to press any legal claim or dispute any arrangement, but simply because the girl was Thomas's daughter and she was growing old. She asked whether it might be possible for Lydia to bring Clara to Harding for a visit. Lydia sat with this for a long time. She showed it to Silas that evening. He read it carefully. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. "She was not kind to me, but she is Thomas's mother and Clara will grow up and want to know where she came from." "Then you go," he said, "and I go with you and we do it on your terms." She looked at him. "Unless you want to go alone," he said. "No," she said, "I don't want to go alone." They went to Harding in March, taking the wagon, the journey of 2 days with a stop at a way station overnight. Lydia Merriweather was living in a smaller house than Lydia remembered, an older woman than Lydia had pictured from the distance of 6 months, gray and slightly shrunken in the way of someone who had been ill and was not fully recovered. She received them in her parlor, and there was a stiff and uncomfortable first hour during which Lydia sat with the upright composure of someone who had prepared herself for many things and was currently preparing herself for several simultaneously, and Silas sat beside her with the quiet steadiness that was his particular brand of support. Eliza looked at Clara, who was 14 months old and too busy examining Eliza's parlor with the comprehensive attention of a natural explorer to be much interested in social awkwardness, and something in the old woman's face changed. "She has Thomas's eyes," Eliza said. "Yes," Lydia said. There was a pause. "I was not kind to you," Eliza said, not easily, in the manner of someone who had perhaps rehearsed this and still found it difficult. "When Thomas died, I was very angry and I put it in the wrong direction." Lydia waited. "You raised her well," Eliza said, looking at Clara. "She is a healthy child, a sturdy child." A pause. "Thomas would have been glad." Lydia felt something loosen in her chest, an old tightness, something she had been holding since the winter after Thomas died, since the cold parlor in Harding and the thin hospitality and the clear message that she was not wanted. "He would have loved her very much," Lydia said, and she meant it because whatever Thomas's failures had been, they were not cruelty, just weakness, and he had held Clara in the 2 months she had lived before he died with a gentleness that was entirely real. The visit lasted 3 hours. It was not warm exactly, but it was honest, which was better. When they left, Eliza pressed a small brooch into Lydia's hand, a small thing of gold and jet, and said it had been Thomas's grandmother's and that Clara should have it when she was older. "We can come again," Lydia said at the door. Eliza looked at her and nodded once, and the nod contained something that was perhaps the closest Lydia Merriweather could come to gratitude. On the road back, Clara asleep in the wagon bed with a blanket tucked around her and Henry fed and quiet in the basket between them, Silas reached across and took Lydia's hand where it rested on the seat. She turned it palm up and laced her fingers through his. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Better than that." The road stretched ahead of them, wide and empty under a March sky the color of clean linen, and the horses moved steady, and the land on either side was beginning its slow spring greening, and Lydia thought that this was a journey that closed something behind them and opened something ahead, which was the best kind of journey. Spring came to the Barlow ranch with the urgency of a season that had been holding itself back and now intended to make up for it. The calves arriving in quick succession, the grass coming up green and strong, the work expanding to fill all available daylight and a good deal of the night. Orrin's family came to visit for a week in April, his wife and 2 of his grown children, and the ranch was full in a way that felt abundant rather than crowded. every room warm with voices, and the kitchen running from before dawn until late evening. Lydia found she loved this, the fullness of it, the way the ranch felt like something more than a business when it was full of people who were attached to it with feeling. She had grown up in a house that was quiet in the wrong way, quiet because her father had been a reserved man, and her mother had been ill for much of her childhood, and the noise and presence of a full house had always seemed to her a thing she wanted and had not been sure she deserved. She was coming to understand that deserving and having were two different categories, and that the latter did not require the former. Hattie's rheumatism had been worsening over the winter, and by the spring of 1880 it was clear that the heavier work of the kitchen was becoming difficult for her. Lydia had been quietly absorbing more and more of it without making it obvious, out of respect for Hattie's dignity. But one morning Hattie sat down at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and said, "I need to talk to you about something." "Of course," Lydia said. "My sister in San Antonio has been asking me to come and live with her for 2 years," Hattie said. "I have been saying no because this place needed keeping." Lydia looked at her. "It does not need me to keep it anymore," Hattie said, in the straightforward and completely unsentimental way that made her, somehow, more moving than if she had wept. "You keep it. You keep it very well." "I would like to go to my sister." Lydia stood at the stove and felt the full weight of this, what it meant that Hattie Carlson, who had been a fixed and unmovable part of this place long before Lydia arrived, was ready to leave it. "We will miss you terribly," Lydia said. "Yes," Hattie agreed without false modesty, "but you will manage." Silas received the news with the quiet acceptance of a man who understood that things changed, and that the right response to change was not to resist it, but to honor it appropriately. He arranged a wagon to take Hattie to the stage line in Cutter's Creek, and he gave her 3 months' additional wages and a letter of appreciation that he wrote himself, and that Lydia was fairly certain had taken him most of an evening. Hattie's departure was in May, on a warm morning with all the hands out to see her off, and Clara, who had decided she loved Hattie with the passionate specificity of toddlerhood, clinging to Hattie's skirt and requiring considerable negotiation to release. Hattie crouched down to Clara's level and said, in her direct and entirely unemotional way, "I will write you a letter." Clara considered this. "Write it soon," she said. Hattie stood up and hugged Lydia with a firmness and brevity that communicated everything important, then shook Silas's hand, which he received, and then converted into an embrace that Hattie tolerated for exactly 3 seconds before patting his arm and stepping back. She climbed into the wagon, and Rope drove her to Cutter's Creek, and the ranch was quieter for several days in a way that was a specific shape of quiet. Lydia wrote to Hattie every 3 weeks, and Hattie wrote back in her compressed, precise hand with observations about San Antonio and her sister and various matters that interested her. And these letters became a regular and cherished part of the rhythm of the ranch. By the summer of 1880, the Barlow Ranch was running differently than it had 2 years before, not larger, not radically changed, but with a depth to it that had not been there before. There was a garden now, planted by Lydia in the spring with the practical intention of reducing the supply order, but grown into something that was also beautiful. Rows of kitchen vegetables backed by sunflowers that turned their faces to the Texas sky with a cheerfulness that she found unreasonably satisfying. There were window boxes on the porch that Clara had helped plant with the seeds of some flowers that Lydia had ordered from a catalog in Cutter's Creek, and when they bloomed in July in shades of red and orange and yellow, they made the porch look like something out of a painting. Silas looked at the flowers one morning and said, "The hands are not going to let me hear the end of this." "Let them try," Lydia said. "I will recruit Clara." Clara, who was 2.5 and had developed strong views on most subjects, would indeed have been a formidable ally. The hands, as it happened, did not say a word, because Orrin's wife had mentioned to Orrin that the flowers were very fine, and Orrin had relayed this to the others with the specificity of a man communicating important information, and after that the flowers were simply part of the place. Silas finished the water tank in August, and it was a good piece of engineering, built with the help of a man named Alvarez from the neighboring town who had a reputation for knowing water and the land's relationship to it, and it changed the management of the south pasture considerably for the better. Lydia had been part of the planning of it, had sat at the kitchen table with Silas and Alvarez on 2 different evenings going over the diagrams and the costs and the logistics, and when it was done and working, she felt the satisfaction of it as a shared thing. They stood at the edge of the south pasture and watched the cattle come to the new trough on the first morning it was operational, and Silas put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they watched the longhorns drink with the comfortable pleasure of watching something work. "Good," he said. "Very good," she agreed. September of 1880 brought an unexpected visitor who was not unwelcome. A young woman arrived at the gate of the Barlow Ranch on a Thursday afternoon, 20 years old, traveling alone on a tired horse with a letter in her hand addressed to Silas Barlow. She was his younger brother's daughter, a niece named Pearl, and the letter explained that Pearl's mother, Silas's sister-in-law, had died in the spring, and Pearl's father, Silas's brother Daniel, was working the railways in Kansas and had no means to keep Pearl with him. The letter asked whether Pearl might stay at the Barlow Ranch for a time, while Daniel got himself established somewhere stable. Silas read the letter and looked at his niece, who was standing straight-backed and clear-eyed and clearly determined not to appear as uncertain as she undoubtedly felt. "Of course," Silas said. "Come inside." Lydia, watching from the kitchen doorway, felt something warm and recognizing move through her at those words, at the ease and certainty with which he said them. She went out to meet Pearl, who had light brown hair and a direct manner and a handshake that was firm without being performative. "I do not want to be a burden," Pearl said. "You will not be," Lydia said. "This house runs better with more people in it. Come and have something to eat." Pearl proved to be an enormous help, not because she was asked to earn her place, but because she was simply constitutionally incapable of being idle, a quality Lydia recognized with a fellow feeling that immediately established a practical kinship between them. Pearl was particularly good with the horses and with the accounts, having been taught figures by a schoolteacher in her hometown who had recognized a mathematical mind and engaged it accordingly. She and Lydia sat at the kitchen table on several evenings going over the ranch books, and Pearl had a way of seeing patterns in numbers that Lydia found both impressive and deeply useful. Pearl also had a rather noticeable effect on Rope, who had always been cheerful and friendly but had become, in Pearl's presence, somewhat more carefully dressed and considerably more thoughtful about when he entered the kitchen. Lydia noticed this first, then Silas noticed it, and they exchanged a look across the dinner table on a Tuesday in October that communicated everything and required no words. "He is 22, Lydia said later, when they were alone. "She is 20, Silas said. "Good ages," Lydia said. "Leave it be," he said, but he was almost smiling. "I am absolutely leaving it be," she said. She was entirely leaving it be. Pearl wrote to her father in Kansas every week, and Daniel Barlow wrote back with the regularity and brevity of a man who was working very hard and had limited time for correspondence, but whose love for his daughter was legible through every short sentence. By December, he had secured a more stable position on a railway maintenance crew in Missouri, and he wrote to say he was looking at renting a small house and would Pearl like to come to him in the spring. Pearl read this letter at the kitchen table and was quiet for a moment. "You could stay here," Lydia said. "If you wanted to stay here." Pearl looked at her. "You are not just saying that." "I am not just saying anything," Lydia said. "You are useful and you are family and this house is large enough." Pearl looked down at the letter. "I would like to go and see my father," she said, "and I think I should because he is alone and he is my father, but," she paused, "might I come back after if it seems right?" "This door is always open to you," Lydia said, and she meant it without reservation. Pearl went to her father in Missouri in April of 1881, and Rope was somber for about 2 weeks after she left, which everyone tactfully did not remark on. Lydia had given Pearl the address of a boarding house in the nearest town to Daniel's house that had been recommended as respectable, and Pearl had given Lydia her father's Missouri address, and they wrote to each other with a regularity that deepened over the months into something that felt like true friendship. In June, Pearl wrote to say her father was well established and thinking of remarrying a woman named Agnes who seemed very kind. And in July, she wrote to say could she come back to Texas in August, please, and she would be glad of the work. Rope, upon being informed that Pearl was returning in August, became noticeably less somber and considerably more attentive to the state of his hair. "Leave it be," Silas told Lydia, when he caught her expression. "I am absolutely leaving it be," she said. "I can tell," he said. August of 1881 brought Pearl back to the ranch and also brought the first significant drought the property had experienced since the bad one of 1874. The summer had been dry and the grass was suffering, and the water table had dropped enough to affect the well output. And Silas spent considerable time that August managing water rationing and moving cattle between pastures, and making assessments of what would be needed if the dry spell extended into the fall. It was hard work and anxious work, the kind of work that tested the character of a ranch and the people running it, and Lydia found herself in the middle of it as fully as Silas, making the decisions about the household water use and the kitchen garden and the supply ordering, cutting back where it needed cutting and holding firm where it needed holding. The dry spell broke in mid-September with 3 days of steady, soaking rain that turned the yard to mud and the creek to something actually recognizable as a creek. And the hands stood in the rain and let it fall on them for a while before Lydia called them in for coffee. And there was a feeling in the kitchen that evening that was the particular feeling of a difficulty survived, warm and grateful and a little exhausted. The garden had not survived well, most of it burned by the August heat, but the sunflowers had stubbornly persisted, and in the September rain they stood and received it with the upright satisfaction of things that had held on and been right to do so. Clara, who was 3 now and had strong feelings about the garden, inspected the surviving plants with the serious concern of someone assessing damage, and declared that the sunflowers were fine and the rest would grow again next year. "Next year," Lydia agreed, which was a statement that contained an entire philosophy. The winter of 1881 was mild, and the ranch rested into it gratefully. Pearl and Rope had, by this point, arrived at an understanding that was not explicitly stated, but was visible to everyone who ate meals at the kitchen table, which was all of them, in the way that they moved around each other with the careful consideration of 2 people who had decided that the other person mattered considerably. On a January evening, Rope came to find Silas in the barn, and they had a conversation that lasted about 20 minutes and which Lydia was not privy to. But afterwards Silas came to find her in the kitchen and said, with the neutral expression he used when he was concealing amusement, "Rope has asked me whether he might speak to Pearl." "Speak to Pearl," Lydia repeated. "With a view to a formal understanding," Silas confirmed. Lydia set down the bowl she was holding. "And what did you say?" "I said that Pearl was her own woman and the question was hers to answer," he said, "but that he had my blessing to ask her." Lydia looked at him. "You are very pleased about this," he said. "I am absolutely neutral about this," she said. "You are very convincing," he said. Pearl said yes to Rope, whose actual name, which emerged formally during the discussion, was Arthur James Halley, which Clara received as remarkable information and repeated several times to confirm its reality. The understanding between Pearl and Rope, or Arthur, was a quiet and settled thing, the engagement of 2 practical young people who had arrived at a decision through thorough attention to each other over a substantial period of time, and it suited them completely. They were married in the spring of 1882, in the same parlor where Silas and Lydia had been married, by the same Reverend Oakes, who by this point felt like a fixture of the ranch's significant moments. Pearl wore a cream-colored dress that Lydia had helped her alter, and Rope wore his best jacket and the expression of a man who could not quite believe his current circumstances, but was entirely prepared to accept them. Clara was the flower girl, a role she undertook with great gravity and a very thorough distribution of wildflowers. Henry, who was 2.5 and had very definite opinions about everything, sat through the ceremony in Silas's lap and periodically offered commentary that Silas patiently suppressed. After the ceremony, standing on the porch in the April evening, watching Pearl and Rope talking with Orrin and his wife in the yard below, Silas came to stand behind Lydia and put his arms around her, and she leaned back against his chest. "Good day," he said. "Very good day," she said. Clara appeared at the edge of the porch steps, still clutching her flower basket, and regarded her parents. "Can I have more pie?" she asked. "Yes," said Lydia. "Absolutely," said Silas. Clara returned to the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had gotten exactly the answer she expected and was not going to waste time being surprised by it. The years that followed were the years of building, the years that a life becomes what it is going to be. The ranch grew steadily, not dramatically, in the measured and reliable way of something that is being tended by people who understand what they are doing and love what they are working for. Silas extended the herd and rebuilt the barn in 1883 with the help of most of the neighboring ranchers, which was how barn raisings worked. A community coming together because community was the only practical response to the scale of the work. And the new barn was solid and spacious, and had a loft that Clara immediately identified as the perfect location for all the activities her parents were unlikely to sanction, if observed directly. Lydia established a small lending library in the front parlor, which sounds like a grand thing, and was actually a collection of about 40 books that she had accumulated over several years, and which she offered to anyone who wanted to borrow them, from the ranch hands to the neighbors, and which had grown by 1884 to about 90 books through donations, and the occasional purchase from the dry goods store in Cutter's Creek, which had begun carrying a small selection of books at Lydia's suggestion to the owner. In 1883, Lydia had their third child, a boy they named James, after Rope's middle name and also Silas's grandfather. James was a calmer baby than Henry had been, with his father's dark hair and Lydia's particular way of looking at things, thoughtful and level, and he slept through most things in the first year with the equanimity of someone who had assessed the situation and found it acceptable. Henry, by this point almost 4 and in full command of his opinions, received James with a mixture of suspicion and proprietary interest that eventually resolved into a fierce and lopsided protectiveness. The protection of a small boy who has decided something is his responsibility and intends to take that seriously. Clara, who was 5, received James with the authority of someone who had already done this once and knew the procedure, and immediately began educating him in her particular way, speaking to him at length about the horses and the garden and the state of various matters on the ranch, as though he were fully equipped to engage with the information, which seemed to suit him fine. Silas held James on the evening of his birth in the same way he had held Henry, with that wide-open expression that was entirely unguarded and deeply real. And Lydia, watching from the bed, thought that she had never loved a person more thoroughly in her life than she loved this man, and that this feeling had only become more specific and more certain with every year that added itself to the account. She also thought about the woman she had been when she had walked through the gate of this ranch, worn through at the heels, 37 cents in her pocket, a baby on her hip and nowhere left to go, and the woman she was now, and the distance between those two women was not a distance of years or even of circumstances, but of something deeper, of knowing who she was and where she belonged and having both of those things be the same place. She thought about it the way you think about a road you have walked when you are standing comfortably at the end of it, with gratitude for having walked it and no desire to walk it again. In the spring of 1884, a letter arrived from Hattie Carlson in San Antonio, written in that familiar compressed hand, informing them that Hattie's sister had died peacefully the previous winter, and that Hattie was considering her situation, which was a Hattie way of saying she was not sure what to do next. Lydia wrote back the same day she received the letter and said that the spare room at the end of the hall was still exactly where it had always been, and the door was open if Hattie wanted it. 3 weeks later, Hattie arrived on the stage from San Antonio with 2 trunks and the Amber dog, who had apparently been living with Hattie in San Antonio for 2 years, having traveled there with her when she left and declining to be relocated. "You took the dog," Silas said, when Turner came bounding off the wagon with the enthusiasm of a dog who recognized where he was. "He came with me," Hattie said with dignity. "I did not abduct him." Turner went directly to Clara, who was now 6 and approximately Turner's size, and the reunion was immediate and complete. Hattie's rheumatism had not improved in San Antonio, and in some ways had worsened. But she was not a woman who had ever made her physical comfort the primary criterion of her choices, and she settled back into the Barlow Ranch's kitchen with the purposeful ease of someone returning to something that had always been hers. She could not do the heavy work as she had, but she was still the most efficient peeler of potatoes that Lydia had ever seen, and she had opinions about pastry that were in every way worth hearing. And she sat at the kitchen table with Henry and Clara and later James, and told them stories with the same brisk, matter-of-fact manner she applied to everything, which somehow made the stories more dramatic rather than less. The house was full again. The house was, Lydia thought on a September evening in 1884, the fullest and most completely itself that it had ever been. She was 30 years old. She had 3 children and a husband and Hattie in the spare room and Turner sleeping on the porch steps, and a garden and 90 books in the parlor, and a cattle ranch running under the Texas sky. And she was someone she recognized entirely, someone she had been working toward for all the years of her life without knowing it. She was in the garden that evening, pulling the last of the late tomatoes before the first frost came, and Silas came out from the barn and walked across the yard to her, his hat in his hand, his face weathered and familiar and entirely beloved. He stopped at the edge of the garden and looked at her. "What?" she said, because he had an expression. "Clara told Henry today," he said, "that Turner is the best dog that ever lived." "This is true," Lydia said. Henry disagreed. He said that the best dog that ever lived was a hypothetical dog named Captain that he intends to acquire at some point. "Also possibly true," Lydia said. "They negotiated a compromise," Silas said, "in which Turner is the best current dog and Captain will be best future dog." Lydia looked at him. "They are remarkable children." "They are your children," he said. "They are our children," she said. He came into the garden then, which he rarely did, because he respected the garden as her particular territory but occasionally entered for specific reasons. And he took the basket from her hand and set it on the ground and put his arms around her in the rows of tomato plants under the September sky. She put her arms around him and they stood there for a moment in the late afternoon light, with the barn behind them and the house ahead and the land stretching in every direction, wide and flat and enormous and theirs. "Silas," she said, against his shoulder. "Lydia," he said, his voice low and warm. "I am very glad I walked through that gate," she said. He held her more firmly. "So am I," he said, "every single day." Above them, the Texas sky was doing the thing it did in September, turning the most extraordinary shades of amber and rose. And in the house behind them, Henry could be heard explaining something at considerable volume to James, who was 18 months old, and receiving information with the grave attention of someone who intended to evaluate it when he had more data. And Clara's voice came through the open window, bossing both of them with the efficient authority of someone who had been in charge of this operation from the beginning. And Turner barked once from the porch, a single, satisfied sound. Lydia lifted her face and Silas kissed her, there in the garden in the amber light. And it was the same as the first time and entirely different, because this time it was not the beginning of something tentative and afraid. It was the deepening of something that had already put down roots so strong and so far that nothing was going to move them. When the frost came that night, Lydia's tomato plants were safely pulled and stored, and the house was warm and full of sound, and the fire was lit in the kitchen hearth, and Hattie was at the table with a glass of water and one of the books from the parlor and an expression of contentment so characteristic of her that it looked like her natural resting face. And Clara was explaining to Henry and James why Captain the future dog would need to be trained very specifically. And Silas was sitting across the table from Lydia with his coffee and his account books and his reading glasses. And the glasses were still exactly as endearing as they had been on the first night she noticed them. Maybe. More so, he looked up from the books and caught her looking, and he did not look away. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. 37 cents, she said. He raised an eyebrow because he knew this reference. She had told him the specific detail of that first day more than once, and it had become a kind of shorthand between them for the improbability and the rightness of how things had worked out. "Long way from 37 cents, he said. "A very long way," she agreed. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand and held it, easy and certain, the way he held everything that mattered to him. The fire popped in the hearth. Outside, the first frost of the season was laying itself across the land with the quiet permanence of something that knew it was right where it was supposed to be. And in the morning the world would be white and new, and the children would be up before dawn wanting to see it, and the horses would need seeing too, and there would be coffee to make and bread to bake, and the whole full, demanding, beautiful work of this life to return to. Lydia sat at the table in the warm light and listened to the fire and her children's voices and the wind outside, and held her husband's hand. And she thought that this was what she had been looking for that dusty August day, when she walked through the gate with Clara on her hip and nothing else, and she had not known she was looking for it, and that not knowing had somehow made the finding of it more complete. She had come to a stranger's door at the end of everything she had, and he had looked at her and at the baby and said, without hesitation, "Come inside, both of you." And she had come inside, and she had stayed. And the life they had built from that moment forward was the truest and best and most permanent thing she had ever known, built out of honest work and real love, and the simple, extraordinary daily choice to keep choosing each other, which was the only kind of love that lasted, and the only kind worth having. Outside, the frost deepened and the stars came out above the Texas plain, enormous and clear and indifferent to everything below them, except in the way that vast and permanent things are a comfort to the small and particular lives occurring under them, a reminder that the world is large and steady, and that there is room in it for all the things that matter. For the work and the love and the children sleeping in the house and the fire in the hearth, and two people sitting across a kitchen table holding hands in the light. Silas's thumb moved across her knuckles once, gently, the way it sometimes did when he did not have words for something and did not need them. She held on. The lamp burned low and the night deepened around the ranch, and the Barlow house was quiet with the quiet of something settled and whole, a place that had found its people and its people had found their place, and nothing about that was going to change.